What if the greatest untold story of the Cold War was silently witnessed by a woman who simply refused to look away? It sounds head-shaking, right? The year is 1968. The world holds its breath. The tension was a living thing, thick and suffocating, especially along America's coastlines. Every fishing village, every quiet inlet felt like a potential front line. And then there was the ocean itself. A vast, unknowable, terrifying expanse. Beneath its surface, unseen and unheard, moved the true titans of this silent war: submarines, hunter-killers, silent steel monsters, each one a loaded gun aimed at the heart of an enemy. But what happens when one of these ghosts of the deep, a top-secret Soviet spy, makes a mistake? A single critical error. Not in the depths of the Atlantic, not in the icy waters of the Arctic, but right off the sleepy, unassuming coast of Maine. And what if the only person to see it, the only one to piece together the chilling truth, wasn't a decorated admiral or a seasoned spy, but an ordinary American fisherman's wife? A woman whose only mission was to make sure her family had enough to eat, and that they were safe in their beds at night. Her name was Mary Johnson, and her simple life was about to collide with a secret so profound it could have changed history. But how do you even begin to prove something so impossible when the entire world is determined to believe it never happened? But before we dive deeper, if you're fascinated by the hidden battles of the Cold War, and also if you love your mom, then like and subscribe. It means a lot to us. We appreciate your support. And don't forget to comment your favorite person of this story in the comments section. Mary Johnson lived a life carved from the sea, not the romanticized version you see in movies, but the raw, honest, calloused-hand reality of it. Her world was Monhegan Island, a rugged outpost off the coast of Maine. Population: barely 100 souls, give or take a seasonal artist or two. Her home was a small, weather-beaten house perched on a bluff, its windows constantly lashed by salt spray. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke, old books, and the faint, briny scent that clung to everything on the island. It was 1968, but Monhegan often felt like it existed in another time altogether, untouched by the frantic pace of the mainland. No paved roads, no cars, just footpaths and the rhythmic crash of waves against ancient granite. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, where help was a given and community was everything. Mary was the backbone of her family. Her husband, John, was a lobsterman. Every dawn, long before the first hint of sunrise painted the eastern sky, John would be out on his boat, battling the capricious ocean, pulling up traps and coaxing a living from the unforgiving sea. Mary's days were a symphony of chores: mending nets, cleaning the day's catch, tending a small garden, and most importantly, raising their two children, a boy and a girl, both still young enough to believe in monsters under the bed, but not yet old enough to grasp the real monsters lurking in the world. The Cold War, for all its looming dread, often felt like a distant rumble on Monhegan. News reached them via a crackling radio or a week-old newspaper delivered by the ferry. It was always out there, happening in Berlin or Vietnam or the high-stakes halls of the Pentagon. Not here, not in their quiet corner of the world. But that illusion of safety, that comfortable distance, was about to shatter. It started subtly, not with a bang but with a whisper, a strange, almost imperceptible hum that would occasionally cut through the static on their old transistor radio. Mary was used to the usual sounds of the island: the mournful cry of gulls, the groan of the foghorn, the distant chug of lobster boats. But this hum was different. It wasn't natural. It was mechanical, deep, and had an unsettling regularity, like a massive, hidden engine purring far below the waves. It would come and go, fleeting, a ghost in the airwaves. John dismissed it as interference, a quirk of their antiquated radio set. Just the weather playing tricks, he'd grumble before heading out for another day's work. But Mary had a finely tuned ear for the unusual, a sense born from living in such close proximity to nature's whims. She knew the difference between a natural anomaly and something else. One blustery afternoon, as she was listening to a local news broadcast, mostly about fish prices and the upcoming church bake sale, the hum returned. stronger this time. It drowned out the announcer's voice, a low, throbbing pulse that felt like it was coming from under the house, not through the air. The children, playing with wooden boats on the floor, paused, their small heads cocked, sensing the change in the room's atmosphere. Their mother's sudden stillness was enough to alert them. It lasted for a full minute, then faded as abruptly as it began, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Mary switched off the radio, her hand trembling slightly. "Did you hear that?" she asked her son, who just shrugged, already back to navigating his toy boat through imaginary waves. She knew she wasn't imagining it. This wasn't weather. This wasn't static. This was something powerful, something nearby. The next week, other fishermen started talking. Not openly, not in ways that would worry their wives, but in hushed tones down at the docks, over a shared pipe or a strong cup of coffee. Their sonar equipment was acting up. Readings were erratic. Fish weren't schooling where they should be. And some of them, the older ones, the ones who had seen things during the war, swore they felt a strange vibration in their boats, a low thrum that went right through the hull and into their bones. They blamed faulty gear or unusual currents, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. One evening, after the children were tucked into bed, Mary finally pressed John. "Did you feel anything out there today, John? Anything strange?" He sat by the fire, mending a torn net, his brow furrowed. He was a man of few words, stoic, strong. But tonight there was a tightness around his eyes she hadn't seen before. He sighed, a heavy sound. "My fish finder went wild for a bit north of Burnt Head. Just a blur. Too big for a whale, too fast for anything else." He paused, looking into the dancing flames. "Felt like something massive was down there, moving underneath me." He shook his head, dismissing it. "Probably just a glitch. The sea plays tricks on you, Mary." But the way he said tricks, it sounded less like a certainty and more like a desperate hope. The strange occurrences John had vaguely mentioned to Mary were escalating. It wasn't just a blur on the fish finder anymore. It was a pattern. Day after day, as he piloted his sturdy wooden boat, the sea serpent, through the choppy waters around Monhegan, his equipment would flicker, glitch, or simply die. His compass would spin wildly, then settle back to north as if nothing had happened. His radio, usually a constant companion, would go dead, then crackle back to life, sometimes playing snippets of strange, garbled speech that sounded nothing like English. He'd blame the salt, the damp, the age of the boat. He was a practical man, but even practical men can't ignore the impossible when it starts to tap on their hull. One morning the fog rolled in thick and fast, a shroud descending over the island, swallowing the lighthouse beam, muffling all sound. John was out early, setting new traps near the gully, a deep trench known for its abundant lobsters. The fog was a familiar adversary, but today it felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time he stopped the engine to haul a trap, the silence pressed in, a heavy, unnatural quiet. No gulls, no distant chug of other boats, just the soft slosh of water against his hull. Suddenly, his sonar screen, which had been blank for an hour, flared to life, not with the usual undulating lines of fish, but with a massive, dark shadow moving directly beneath him. It was huge, too huge, and it was moving with an impossible speed for anything natural. His heart hammered against his ribs. He gripped the tiller, straining his eyes against the swirling white. Was it a whale? No, whales move differently. They surface for air. This thing stayed deep, and then he felt it, a vibration, not the gentle thrum of his own engine, but a deep, resonant rumble coming from below. It vibrated through the wooden planks of his boat, up through his boots, a low-frequency hum that seemed to shake his very bones. It was the same sound Mary had described, but amplified 1,000 times. He watched the sonar screen in horrified fascination as the massive shadow paused directly beneath him, then slowly, deliberately began to move away. It wasn't fleeing. It was leaving, like it had decided to simply go. The feeling of being watched intensified. He wasn't just on the ocean. He was floating over something immense, unseen, and utterly alien. When the shadow finally disappeared from his sonar, a profound silence returned. The hum was gone. The fog remained, but now it felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like a deliberate cloak. John started his engine, his hands shaking slightly. He didn't haul another trap that day. He turned the sea serpent around and headed for home, the uneasy feeling clinging to him like the damp sea air. Back on shore, he tried to explain it to his fellow fishermen, but his words felt hollow, unbelievable even to his own ears. Massive shadow, felt it through the hull, silent. They nodded, humored him, suggesting he'd been out too long or seen a particularly big whale. Probably a fin whale, John. They get big, you know, but their eyes didn't quite meet his. They were seeing the change in him. The confident, unshakable John was now a man with a haunted look. Mary saw it too. When he returned, his face was pale, his movements stiff. He didn't complain about the catch or the fog or the price of bait. He just sat by the window, staring out at the churning gray expanse of the ocean, a distant, troubled look in his eyes. He didn't say much, but Mary didn't need him to. She saw the fear in his usually fearless eyes. This was not the same John who wrestled with storms. This was a man who had faced something he couldn't fight, something beyond his understanding. That night, John woke up in a cold sweat. He dreamt of shadows in the water, of a cold, metallic presence gliding beneath his boat, of an unseen eye watching him from the depths. He finally broke his stoic silence. "Mary," he whispered in the dark, his voice rough with terror. "There's something out there, something not right." Mary reached for his hand, her touch reassuring. She didn't need to ask for details, she knew. She had heard the whispers on the radio, seen the strange behavior of the animals, felt the growing unease in the island community. Now she had seen the fear in her husband's eyes. The ocean, their provider, their home, had turned into something else. It was no longer just the sea. It was a hiding place, a hunting ground, and something very dangerous was using it. The hum on the radio wasn't just occasional anymore. It was more frequent, sometimes lasting for minutes. She noticed it was strongest in the dead of night, when the island was asleep, the only sounds the wind and the waves. The children, usually sound sleepers, were starting to stir more often, complaining of strange dreams or a buzzing sound. Mary started keeping a log, dates, times, duration of the hum. She'd jot down anything unusual John mentioned, any strange readings from his boat, any odd behavior from the local wildlife. Her small notebook, tucked away in the kitchen drawer, was becoming a silent testament to a growing, terrifying truth. She began by trying the most obvious route, the Coast Guard. Her first call was to the station on the mainland. "My husband's had some strange sonar readings," she explained, trying to keep her voice calm and authoritative despite the tremor in her hands. "And there's this hum on the radio, a deep, mechanical sound." The voice on the other end was polite, dismissive. "Ma'am, it's probably interference, old equipment. We get a lot of false alarms. You know how the sea can play tricks." The exact words John had used. She tried to explain the pattern, the increasing frequency, the fear in her husband's eyes. The man simply reiterated standard protocols, offered to send a pamphlet on radio interference, and politely ended the call. Frustration simmered. She was not a hysterical woman. She was a woman stating facts. But she quickly realized that without concrete evidence, a photograph, a physical object, something tangible, her claims were just fishermen's tales, exaggerated by an overly imaginative wife. She tried the local sheriff, a burly, well-meaning man who occasionally visited the island. He listened with a patient smile, nodding along as she laid out her case, her carefully documented notes spread across her kitchen table. He suggested checking the wiring in her house, perhaps upgrading her radio. He even offered to send someone to inspect John's boat for electrical issues. "Mary," he said kindly, "I know you're worried about John, but sometimes a little paranoia can get the best of us, especially with all this Cold War talk." Paranoia. The word stung. She wasn't paranoid. She was observant. She was concerned. She was right. But how do you fight against a tide of ingrained dismissal? The islanders, while not openly hostile, began to view her with a mix of concern and pity. "Poor Mary, she's been a bit jumpy lately," they'd whisper. Must be the strain of keeping house for John. They didn't understand. They hadn't heard the hum that vibrated through their very bones. They hadn't seen the primal fear in John's eyes. They hadn't been dismissed by the very people sworn to protect them. But Mary wasn't one to give up. The more she was dismissed, the more determined she became. She remembered stories her grandmother used to tell, old tales of Monhegan during the World Wars, of German U-boats lurking just beyond the horizon, of strange lights in the water. These weren't just stories. They were echoes of a history that proved her intuition wasn't unfounded. The ocean, especially near their strategic coastline, had always been a playground for unseen adversaries. She started spending more time outdoors, walking the bluffs, scanning the horizon with John's old binoculars. She watched the seabirds, noting their flight patterns. She observed the way the currents moved, the subtle shifts in the weather. She was looking for anything out of place, any anomaly that might confirm what her gut was telling her. She was looking for a pattern, a deviation, something concrete she could point to. She knew deep down that she was alone in this, but that didn't make her stop. It made her stronger. It made her more resolute. One crisp afternoon, while walking near the deserted Blackhead Cliffs, she noticed something genuinely peculiar. A patch of water, usually churning and white-capped, was eerily still, too still, like glass. It was a perfect, unnatural calm in the middle of a choppy sea. And beneath that calm she heard it. A faint, deep thrum, barely audible over the wind, but undeniably there. It pulsed, low and steady, a sound that seemed to defy the very laws of the ocean. It was the hum, but stronger, more direct. It felt like it was coming from right below her. She held her breath, staring at that unnaturally placid patch of water, feeling the sound vibrate through the ancient rock beneath her feet. It was close. Too close, and it was waiting. She rushed home, breathless, her heart pounding. She tried to explain it to John, her words tumbling out in a rush. He listened, his face grim. He didn't dismiss her this time. He knew that patch of water. He knew how it should behave. The silence and the hum. It was too specific, too chillingly accurate. He reached for his old Navy telescope, a relic from his brief, forgotten service during Korea. He didn't say a word, just walked out the door, his jaw set. Mary knew then that she wasn't entirely alone. Her husband, perhaps out of love, perhaps out of a shared, growing dread, was finally starting to believe her. But believing was one thing. Proving it and convincing anyone else was a battle she was only just beginning to wage. The intrusions into their lives grew bolder, more direct. It started with subtle interferences. Their small, old generator, which powered their meager electricity, would inexplicably sputter and die in the dead of night, only to restart perfectly the next morning. Their old radio, after broadcasting the chilling hum, would sometimes pick up strange, distorted whispers. Not English, not anything John or Mary recognized. It sounded like a series of harsh clicks and guttural murmurs, then silence. Mary wondered if it was Russian. She couldn't be sure, but the thought sent a shiver down her spine. Then came the incidents that moved beyond mere technical glitches. One day, John's newest lobster traps, laid out just the day before, were found cut adrift, their ropes cleanly severed. Not frayed by rocks, not broken by a storm. Cut. He lost a good portion of his day's potential catch, and the cost of replacing them was a heavy blow to their already tight finances. Raged, blaming vandals from the mainland, but deep down, a colder, more terrifying thought was beginning to take root. Who would come all the way to Monhegan to sabotage a lobsterman, and with such surgical precision? A few days later, a small, unattended dinghy belonging to a neighboring fisherman, Old Man Hemlock, was found floating upside down a mile offshore, its oars missing. Old Man Hemlock swore he'd tied it down securely. Like a rock, he declared, scratching his balding head in confusion. He'd never had a boat simply disappear like that. A strange ripple of unease spread through the small community. Accidents happened, yes, but these felt different, deliberate. Mary and John began to notice things near their home. Footprints in the soft earth by their back door that weren't theirs, too large for her, too small for him. A small, smooth stone, not native to the island, found inexplicably on their doorstep. A faint, acrid smell like burnt metal lingering in the air near the shoreline on certain windless nights. Each tiny detail on its own could be dismissed. Together they painted a chilling picture. Someone or something was coming ashore, observing. interfering. The children, too, started acting out. Their son, little Johnny, woke up one night screaming about a big dark fish with no eyes looking into his window. Their daughter, Sarah, who usually loved playing down by the tide pools, refused to go near the water, clinging to Mary's skirt and whispering about whispers from the deep. Mary tried to reassure them, but her own fear was a palpable thing now. It wasn't just her and John, it was her innocent children, too. Their home, their sanctuary, was being invaded by an unseen force. One terrifying evening, as darkness fell over the island, Mary was out in their small garden gathering herbs. The wind had died down, leaving an oppressive silence. Suddenly, she heard a faint splash from the cove below their house, followed by a metallic clanking sound. Her heart leaped into her throat. She crept to the edge of the bluff, peering down into the murky twilight. Nothing. But the silence that followed felt loaded, as if something had just slipped away, leaving only the echo of its presence. She felt a primal chill, the hair on her arms standing on end. It was the feeling of being hunted, of being prey. She realized then that they weren't just witnessing a phenomenon, they were involved. This unseen entity wasn't just passing through, it was engaging, it was testing, it was studying, and for what purpose? The implications were terrifying. Was it a research vessel, a spy craft, an advanced scout for something far larger, far more sinister? The Cold War's invisible lines of battle had been drawn directly through their peaceful lives. John, consumed by a quiet fury, began taking extra precautions. He started carrying his old hunting rifle on his boat. He kept a loaded shotgun by the door at night. He spent less time fishing, more time simply watching the horizon, his face etched with grim determination. He knew, as Mary knew, that they were facing something beyond their comprehension, beyond their control. But they weren't going to roll over and let it take their home, their peace, their sanity. Just after midnight, the whole house shook with a sickening jolt, as if a giant fist had slammed into the bluff beneath them. The children screamed. The lights flickered, then died, plunging them into suffocating darkness. Mary, clutching her terrified children, fumbled for the lantern while John rushed to the window. Outside, the storm was still howling, but through a momentary break in the clouds, John saw it. Not a flash of lightning, but a strange, green glow emanating from the churning water directly below their house. It pulsed, eerily bright, then vanished. The next morning, as the storm began to abate, the true damage was revealed. Not just downed trees or broken lobster traps, those were expected. What they found was far more disturbing. Along the shoreline, beneath their very bluff, lay scattered wreckage, not from a fishing boat, not from a storm-damaged vessel. These were fragments of something alien, twisted metal, gleaming with an unidentifiable alloy, strange wires, and what looked like a piece of dark, resilient rubber, unlike anything they had ever seen. The stench of burnt ozone hung heavy in the air. This was no ordinary storm damage. This was evidence of a direct, violent impact. Something had hit the rocks, something powerful and unyielding. And then the most terrifying discovery of all. Their small wooden dock, where John tied his sea serpent and where their children often played, was utterly obliterated, splintered into 1,000 pieces, not by the storm's waves, but by a precise, crushing force. It looked less like it had been broken and more like it had been torn apart. The clear implication was that whatever had hit the bluff, whatever had caused that green flash, had also deliberately destroyed their dock. It wasn't an accident anymore. This was a message, a warning, a declaration. Mary stood amidst the wreckage, clutching her children close, her heart a cold, hard knot of fury. Her family's lifeline, their connection to the sea, their very sense of security, had been violated. Her children were traumatized, clinging to her, their small faces pale with fear. They weren't just paranoid anymore. They were being targeted, and the authorities. They would likely dismiss this too, blame the storm, blame the waves, blame anything but the chilling, undeniable truth she held in her hands. A slow, burning realization ignited within Mary. Nobody was coming to help them. No government agency, no Coast Guard, no sheriff. They were on their own. They were the front line. This wasn't just about strange noises or damaged equipment anymore. This was about survival. This was about her children's safety. And in that moment, standing amidst the splinters of their shattered dock, a fierce, primal resolve hardened within her. She looked at John, his face a mask of weary anger. "They won't believe us, will they?" she asked, her voice low but steady. John shook his head, his gaze fixed on the destroyed dock. "No," he rumbled, "they won't." "Then we make them believe," Mary said, her eyes burning with an unshakable determination. "We give them something they can't ignore." John turned to her, a flicker of surprise in his grim eyes. He knew Mary's strength, her resilience, but he also knew her caution. This was different. This was a line being crossed. Mary's mind was racing, connecting every hum, every strange reading, every piece of sabotage, every dismissive phone call. She thought of the green glow, the metallic debris, the chilling perfection of the dock's destruction. She thought of her children's terrified faces. She realized the unseen adversary was not just observing, it was actively trying to silence them, to drive them away, or worse. She looked out at the vast, indifferent ocean, then back at the small, sturdy remains of their home, her family's home, and she knew what she had to do. The world had turned a blind eye, the authorities had dismissed her, but a mother protecting her young. That was a force of nature even the most powerful nations couldn't ignore. She had an idea. A desperate, dangerous, unthinkable idea. An idea born of pure desperation and an unyielding will to protect her family. It was reckless. It was audacious. And if it failed, it could cost them everything. Mary's mind, usually a calm harbor, was now a tempest of thoughts. The green glow, the metallic debris, the destroyed dock, these weren't random acts. They were calculated. They were meant to terrorize, to silence. But they had done the opposite. They had ignited a fire in her. She looked at John, his shoulders slumped, his face grim. He was a man of action, but against an unseen, silent enemy, his harpoons and nets were useless. He needed a target, and Mary was going to give him one. Her idea started, as so many profound ideas do, with something simple, something familiar. Not with maps of global politics or military tactics, but with lobster pots. She had spent her life mending them, baiting them, watching them disappear into the depths, only to be hauled back up, brimming with their prizes. A trap. The sea was full of them. Fishermen laid them, patiently waiting. Nature used them too, in the form of currents and tides. The submarine, this phantom presence, was a predator, but even predators had habits, patterns. They moved, they observed, they returned. "They destroyed our dock," Mary said, her voice surprisingly calm, cutting through the heavy silence in their kitchen. "They want us gone. They want us quiet." John grunted, pouring himself another cup of coffee, black as night. "And they nearly took out the children," she continued, her voice hardening. "That changes things, John. We don't just survive this now. We fight." John looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He saw not fear, but a cold, steely resolve he'd rarely witnessed, even through their hardest times. "Fight what, Mary? A ghost?" "We can't even see the thing." "We might not see it, but we can hear it. We can feel it," she countered, pointing a finger at her temple. "And we know the sea, John, better than any of their scientists in fancy uniforms. We know its currents, its sounds, its hidden places." She walked over to the kitchen table, pulling out the small notebook she'd been keeping. "Look," she said, flipping through the pages. "The hum, always strongest near Blackhead or the gully, and always at night or in the thick fog when they think they're invisible." She tapped a finger on a date. "The day your sonar went wild, foggy morning. The day my radio went dead, middle of the night." She pointed to a crude map she'd sketched of Monhegan Island and its surrounding waters. "They're using the deep trenches, the hidden channels. That's where they hide. And they come closer to shore to observe, to listen, to gather intelligence." John stared at the map, then at her. "So, you're saying it's a spy submarine?" Mary nodded slowly. What else could it be? Why else would it be so careful, so silent, so persistent? Why else would they deliberately destroy our dock after being spotted? "They're trying to scare us off, John, because we know too much." Then came the audacious part, the core of her unthinkable blueprint. "We can't sink it," she began, "and we can't catch it like a fish. But we can expose it, force it to the surface, make it impossible for them to deny." John leaned forward, his skepticism warring with a growing flicker of hope. How? With what? A pea shooter. Sound, Mary declared. They're silent hunters, right? They rely on stealth. What if we make so much noise in just the right way, in just the right place, that they can't hide anymore, that they have to move, and when they move, we'll be ready? Her plan, a daring blend of intuition and local knowledge, began to take shape. She envisioned a web, not of physical rope, but of sound. A specific, relentless, maddening sound. And then another layer, a physical indicator, something that would mark their presence when they were forced into shallower, more visible waters. She remembered an old tale from her grandfather, a strategy used by local fishermen during Prohibition to warn each other of approaching revenue cutters, dropping heavy chains to the bottom, creating a racket that carried for miles underwater. We need sound, she explained, her voice gaining momentum. Loud, persistent, non-stop. Something that would mess with their sonar, deafen their hydrophones, drive them mad. And we need to place it in their hiding spots, where they think they're safe. She pointed to the gully on her map. Deep, perfect for a submarine to sit and listen. But what kind of sound, and how to produce it? She thought about every loud, persistent sound she knew. The foghorn, too irregular. Dynamite, too risky and too obvious. Then her eyes fell on the old church bell tower, visible from their window. It rang every Sunday, a deep, resonant peal that carried across the island. But it was also used for emergencies, ringing rapidly to summon help. And the bells in the lobster buoys which chimed with the waves. They were too small, too subtle. She needed something industrial, something raw. And then it hit her. The old abandoned quarry on the far side of the island. It had a massive, ancient air compressor and a pneumatic drill left over from years ago when they tried to extract more granite. It was loud enough to shake the earth, and if aimed into the water. John listened, a slow smile spreading across his face. He began to see it. He began to believe. This wasn't some wild fantasy. This was cunning. This was Monhegan. This was their fight. And then what? He asked, a glint in his eye. They surface and say, "Oops, you caught us." Convincing John was one thing. He had seen the evidence, felt the fear, witnessed the destruction. But enlisting others on Monhegan, that was a gamble. Monhegan was a place where secrets were hard to keep and gossip spread faster than a nor'easter. To speak of Soviet submarines, of a conspiracy, would brand them as mad or worse, expose their plan before it even began. Yet Mary knew they couldn't do it alone. The quarry equipment was heavy, dangerous. The trap would require multiple vantage points, multiple pairs of eyes. She decided to approach only those she trusted implicitly, those who had seen enough of the strange occurrences to already have doubts, and most importantly, those with the skills they desperately needed. Her first confidant after John was Old Man Hemlock. He was a crusty, weathered lobsterman nearing 80, but with eyes as sharp as an eagle's and a memory like steel. He had lived through 2 world wars, seen U-boats pass the island in the dead of night, and never truly trusted the peace that followed. He was also the one whose dinghy had been cut loose. Mary found him down at the docks, mending his nets, his face a road map of sun and salt. She didn't mince words. "Hemlock," she began, her voice low. "Something tried to sink my house. It took out John's dock. And I think it cut your dinghy loose." Hemlock paused, his gnarled fingers stilling. He looked at her, then glanced around, making sure they were alone. "Storm, Mary, happens," but his eyes betrayed his words. "No," she insisted. "Not a storm, something with engines, something that hums under the water, something that watches us." She recounted the green glow, the metallic fragments, her children's screams. She told him about the hum she'd heard, the sonar readings, the way her radio picked up strange sounds, and she told him about her plan. To flush IT out, to expose IT. Hemlock listened, not with skepticism, but with a deep, unsettling familiarity. He had seen too much in his life to dismiss the impossible. He remembered the phantom lights, the odd radio static that would sometimes plague the island during the wars. So, a U-boat, he mused almost to himself. Thought we'd seen the last of them, but these new ones, they're quiet, aren't they? Mary nodded, Too quiet, but we can make them make noise. She explained the quarry compressor idea. Hemlock's eyes lit up. He had worked in that quarry as a young man. He knew every lever, every rusted bolt of that old machinery. That old beast, he chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. It'll shake the very foundations of hell, let alone a submarine, but it's heavy, needs a crew. Their small conspiracy grew. Next was Tom, a young man who ran the island's only general store and knew every piece of equipment on the island. He was quiet, resourceful, and had a knack for mechanics. He'd seen the strange looks on John's face, heard the worried whispers from his customers about unusual disturbances. Mary told him the truth, pulling him aside in the back room of his store, showing him the metallic fragment she'd retrieved from their bluff. He turned it over in his hand, his brow furrowed. It was too dense, too strange for any local boat. He was in. Then came Sarah's uncle, Ben, a retired Coast Guard veteran who lived on the opposite side of the island. He owned a powerful pair of military-grade binoculars, a relic from his service, and knew the currents and shoals like the back of his hand. He was skeptical at first, citing protocols and official channels. But Mary appealed to his sense of duty, his love for the island, and the fear in her children's eyes. "Ben," she said, looking him straight in the eye, "they destroyed our dock. They almost hit my kids. Your old colleagues on the mainland won't help. We're on our own. And if we don't do something, who knows what they'll do next." He looked at the fragment she'd brought, studied it carefully. The fear in Mary's voice, the cold, hard logic of her story, chipped away at his official skepticism. He agreed to help, but only to observe. No heroics, he warned, just eyes and a radio. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. They would use the old quarry compressor to create an unbearable noise in the gully, the deep trench where the submarine often hid. This would force it to move. Then, as it attempted to find a quieter hiding spot in shallower waters, they would have observers positioned around the island, ready to spot it. And finally, the critical component, a series of makeshift depth charges disguised as ordinary lobster pots, designed not to destroy, but to mark its position with an unmissable visual cue if it got too close. Their first challenge was the quarry. The abandoned granite quarry was a formidable place, a gaping maw carved into the island's rock. The old compressor, a rusted behemoth, hadn't run in decades. Tom, the store owner, was their mechanical genius. For 3 days, under the guise of clearing out junk for the annual island cleanup, they worked in shifts, meticulously cleaning, lubricating, and repairing the ancient engine. The air was thick with the smell of grease and rust, the sounds of wrenches clanking and metal groaning. John and Hemlock moved immense boulders, cleared debris. Mary, ostensibly bringing them coffee and sandwiches, acted as lookout, her eyes constantly scanning the sea and the paths leading to the quarry. Finally, with a mighty cough and a cloud of black smoke, the compressor roared to life. The ground vibrated. The sound was deafening, a monstrous pneumatic thrum that seemed to tear through the very air. They quickly built a makeshift baffle and directed the sound output towards the sheer cliff face that overlooked the gully, amplifying the sonic assault down into the water. It wasn't just loud. It was a rhythmic, oppressive sound, designed to penetrate steel hulls and drive any crew inside to distraction. Next came the depth markers. These were Mary's brainchild, combining her knowledge of fishing and her desperation. She and John spent long nights in their shed, far from prying eyes, modifying old lobster pots. Instead of bait and escape vents, they installed small, buoyant buoys, painted a stark, reflective yellow, a color easily spotted even in low light or fog. Attached to these buoys within the pot were small, weighted charges, not explosives but sealed bags of highly pigmented, non-toxic dye that would activate upon impact, releasing a vibrant, persistent plume of color into the water. The plan was to drop these marker pots along a predetermined path they believed the submarine would take if flushed from the gully. The dye would be visible from the air, or even from the bluffs, for hours. The most delicate part was deploying these markers. They couldn't just scatter them randomly. John, using his lifetime of experience, plotted a course based on the deepest channels, the prevailing currents, and where he'd consistently felt the phantom vibration. He and Hemlock spent days dropping these modified pots, carefully spaced, their presence masked by regular lobster traps. They used their small, unassuming lobster boats, blending into the everyday rhythm of Monhegan's fishing fleet, hoping no one would notice the subtle difference in their patterns, the extra care they took with certain lines. Ben, the retired Coast Guard veteran, was their eyes. He set up his post on the highest point of the island, a secluded spot with an unobstructed view of the surrounding waters. He had his powerful binoculars, a compass, and a shortwave radio set to a private frequency. His task was to scan, to pinpoint any unusual movements, any anomalous ripples, any signs of the submarine attempting to surface or escape. He was the most reluctant participant, his military training screaming against such an amateur, risky venture, but the fragment of metal Mary had shown him, combined with the escalating incidents, had eroded his professional detachment. Mary, meanwhile, was everywhere. She coordinated, she kept morale up, she brought supplies, and she maintained her log, meticulously tracking every detail. The strain was immense. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant sound a warning. They were working against time, against a silent, unseen enemy, and against the crushing weight of their own isolation. The days following the trap's deployment were a torment of anticipation. Every creak of the house, every distant boat horn, every shift in the wind sent a jolt through Mary. The air on Monhegan, usually so crisp and clean, now felt heavy with unspoken tension. John and Hemlock still went out, ostensibly fishing, but their eyes were constantly on the water, their hands never far from their radio sets. Tom kept the quarry compressor ready, its ancient engine lubricated, waiting for the signal. Ben, high on his bluff, was a statue of vigilance, his binoculars fixed on the endless horizon. The submarine, however, seemed to have vanished. No hums, no glitches, no subtle disturbances. It was as if it had sensed their intentions, or had retreated to lick its wounds after the dock incident. Doubt, a creeping, insidious thing, began to worm its way into their resolve. Had they miscalculated? Had it moved on? Were they simply chasing shadows, driven mad by paranoia? Mary, however, refused to yield to the doubt. She kept studying her log, tracing patterns, listening to the subtle shifts in the island's rhythm. She noticed a prolonged period of calm, almost unnatural in the currents around the gully, even when the rest of the ocean was choppy, too quiet. That was often the LOUDEST signal. Then 3 weeks after the markers were deployed, it happened. Not with a bang, but with a whisper, then a roar. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon. A thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the island in a familiar, suffocating shroud. Mary was in her kitchen, cleaning the last of the day's catch, when her radio, tuned to their private frequency, crackled to life. It was Ben, his voice clipped, urgent. Mary, contact, bearing 270 just north of the gully. Large, deep, moving slow, too slow for a ship, too big for anything else. And I'm hearing it, a low thrum, very faint, but it's there. Mary's heart leaped into her throat. It was back. The beast was back. She immediately radioed John. It's in the gully, get the compressor going. John's voice came back, tight with adrenaline. On it. Hemlock's with me, tell Tom. Within minutes, a monstrous roar ripped through the fog-laden air from the quarry. The old compressor, pushed to its limits, sent a deafening pneumatic assault vibrating through the island and down into the depths of the gully. It wasn't just noise, it was an infrasonic wave designed to penetrate water, to overwhelm sonar, to create an unbearable cacophony for anything hiding beneath. The ground shook. Windows rattled. Birds erupted from the trees, confused and disoriented. The weight was agonizing. Mary stood at her window, staring out at the swirling white fog, picturing the submarine deep below, suddenly engulfed in this man-made hell of sound. What would they do? How would they react? Would they flee? Would they surface? Then Ben's voice again, even more urgent this time. It's moving, moving fast, coming out of the gully, bearing 330, shallowing UP. heading north-northwest towards Seal Rock. This was it, the moment of truth. The submarine, unable to endure the sonic assault, was trying to escape, exactly as Mary had predicted, and it was heading right into their trap. Seal Rock was a treacherous area, shallower, with hidden ledges and strong currents, and that's where John and Hemlock had laid their first string of marker pots. John's voice crackled through the radio, breathless with effort. "We're in position, Mary. Visibility's awful, but the currents are pushing it right towards our lines." The fog was so thick Mary couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. She paced her kitchen, every muscle in her body tense, listening to the disembodied voices on the radio, picturing the invisible drama unfolding out on the sea. The compressor continued its earth-shaking roar, a relentless drumbeat of defiance. Then a sudden sharp cry from John. Impact! We felt it right off our bow. A moment of static, then there it is, a plume, yellow, just off Seal Rock. It hit one of the markers. Mary gasped. It worked. They had hit it. The yellow dye meant to bloom into the water was her physical evidence, her undeniable proof. Another one. Hemlock shouted, his ancient voice filled with a surprising surge of exhilaration. And another. They're running right through them. Yellow, everywhere. Ben's voice chimed in, his usual stoicism replaced by a note of sheer astonishment. "My God, Mary, I can see it even through the fog. A patch of yellow, big, moving. It's a submarine. A massive shadow beneath the color." The compressor was still roaring, a symbol of their triumph, but now above its deafening din came the sounds of shouts and excited cries from the radio. The phantom of the deep, the silent hunter, was no longer silent, no longer hidden. It was marked. It was exposed, and it was trying desperately to escape its humiliation. Mary ran out of her house, not caring about the fog or the cold or the potential danger. She scrambled to the highest point of her bluff, peering out into the swirling white. She couldn't see the submarine, but she could see it. Just off Seal Rock, even through the dense fog, an unholy, vibrant patch of fluorescent yellow was spreading across the surface of the water, moving with an unmistakable, unnatural speed. It was a stark, almost surreal burst of color against the gray, turbulent sea. It was unmistakable. It was undeniable. It was a Soviet submarine caught in the ACT. The yellow dye, vibrant and impossible, wasn't just a marker, it was a scream. It clawed its way through the fog, a surreal, moving stain on the canvas of the Atlantic. Ben, perched high on the bluffs, his voice still trembling with disbelief, was relaying coordinates faster than Mary could scribble them down. John and Hemlock, out on their boat, were circling the area, their excitement mixed with a profound sense of awe and danger. The compressor in the quarry continued its deafening assault, an insistent, rhythmic thrum that resonated through the very rock of Monhegan Island. Mary, standing on her bluff, squinting through the swirling mist, watched the small, rigid shape of the distressed buoy. It wasn't just bobbing. It seemed to be erratically dipping and resurfacing, as if battling the waves or perhaps fighting something deeper. A sudden, chilling thought struck her. If it was truly in distress, how many men were trapped inside that steel coffin? Her vindication, a moment ago so pure, was now tinged with a cold dread. They hadn't aimed to sink it, only to expose it. But the ocean was unforgiving, and the line between exposure and destruction was perilously thin. "Ben, confirm the buoy. Is it transmitting?" Mary demanded over the radio, her voice tight with a newfound urgency. "Affirmative, Mary. Standard maritime distress frequency. But it's faint. Very faint. Something's wrong with it, or with them." Ben's words hung heavy in the air. A damaged Soviet submarine, a failing distress signal. This was no longer just a confrontation, it was a potential rescue mission, and a diplomatic nightmare. John's voice cut in, strained. "Mary, we're seeing more debris, smaller pieces, not yellow dye, looks like torn metal and something else, floating free." His words confirmed her darkest fears. The impact with the marker pot, or perhaps the subsequent maneuvers to escape the sonic assault, had damaged the vessel. This wasn't just a spy, it was a disabled spy, vulnerable and potentially sinking. The phone lines on Monhegan, usually used for casual chats or ferry schedules, began to light up like a Christmas tree. Ben, on his official radio, was now being bombarded by questions from the Coast Guard. The initial response, as Mary had predicted, was disbelief. "A Soviet submarine, Mr. Harris. Off Monhegan, sir. Are you sure you haven't been imbibing?" The skepticism was thick, laced with condescension. But Ben, an old sea dog, held his ground. "I'm looking at a half-mile-wide yellow slick ensign, and I'm hearing a distress signal from a non-us vessel. And I have coordinates from a lobsterman's sonar that matches everything. You want to send a cutter out, or you want to explain to the Pentagon why you ignored a potential international incident." The tone on the other end of the line shifted. The mention of the Pentagon and the unmissable yellow slick finally broke through the layers of bureaucracy. Within the hour, the faint thrum of approaching helicopters could be heard over the island's roar. The Coast Guard was mobilizing. The Navy, too, was stirring. Mary, watching the sky, felt a strange mix of triumph and terror. Her plan had worked. Too well, perhaps. The fog, as if on cue, began to thin, revealing a terrifying tableau. The immense yellow patch was now undeniably visible, swirling around Seal Rock. And within it, the dark, elongated shape of a submarine, partially visible, listing slightly, its conning tower clearly marked with unfamiliar Cyrillic characters. It wasn't fully surfaced, but it was dangerously close, unable to submerge. The distress buoy continued its erratic dance, a silent testament to the drama unfolding beneath the waves. First came the Coast Guard cutter, a sleek gray vessel, cutting through the chop with purposeful speed. Then two Navy frigates, their silhouettes growing rapidly larger on the horizon, their massive presence dwarfing the Monhegan fishing boats. The sky was soon filled with the thumping rotors of helicopters, their searchlights beginning to pierce the remaining wisps of fog. Mary's small, personal battle had exploded onto the global stage. But the immediate challenge wasn't just confirming the submarine's identity. It was dealing with its crew. The distressed state of the vessel implied either damage or a catastrophic malfunction. The dilemma was immediate: engage and potentially provoke an international incident with a nuclear power, or attempt a rescue and risk exposing top-secret technology. Mary watched, transfixed, as inflatable boats were lowered from the Coast Guard cutter, heading cautiously towards the exposed submarine. Through her binoculars, she saw figures in the conning tower, silhouetted against the gray sky. They looked defeated, exhausted, not triumphant spies but desperate men. The radio crackled again. It was Ben. "Mary, I'm getting reports, official channels. The sub is identified. It's a Project 613 NATO code Whiskey class, Soviet, and it's carrying experimental surveillance equipment. This is big, Mary, real big." The moment of contact between the U.S. Coast Guard and the Soviet submarine crew was etched forever into the consciousness of Monhegan Island. It was a bizarre, almost surreal ballet of international relations played out on the turbulent waters near Seal Rock. The Coast Guardsmen, armed but cautious, approached the listing submarine. Figures emerged from the conning tower, hands raised in a gesture of surrender and desperation. They were gaunt, pale, their uniforms soaked and disheveled. Radio reports, now filtering through Ben's official channels, painted a grim picture. The submarine had suffered severe damage to its ballast tanks and propulsion systems during its evasive maneuvers from the sonic assault. The distress buoy had been deployed out of desperation, its transmission weakened by the damage. They were taking on water slowly sinking. The crew, under strict orders to maintain radio silence, had held out until they were on the brink of disaster, their equipment crippled, their position undeniable. The immediate priority shifted from capture to rescue. American naval personnel, including divers and medical teams, boarded the Soviet vessel. The sight of U.S. Navy ships draped with Russian sailors, many suffering from hypothermia and shock, was an image that would defy Cold War propaganda for years to come. The silent steel monster, once a symbol of unseen threat, was now a shared vulnerability, a stark reminder of the fragile lives beneath the iron curtain of ideology. But rescue was only the first logistical hurdle. The real storm brewed in Washington, D.C. and Moscow. The news, carefully managed at first, inevitably leaked. Soviet submarine crippled off Maine coast. Screamed headlines across the globe. The story, initially dismissed as rumor, then grudgingly acknowledged as fact, became an overnight sensation. And at the heart of it, a confounding detail. The initial discovery was credited not to advanced surveillance or military intelligence, but to local fishermen reporting unusual activity, a euphemism for Mary Johnson and her audacious plan. Washington was in an uproar. How could a Soviet spy submarine penetrate so deeply into American coastal waters, right off a strategic shipping lane, and remain undetected by every sophisticated detection system available? The U.S. Navy brass faced intense scrutiny. Initial reports were contradictory, riddled with denials and deflections. But the evidence was too compelling. A disabled submarine, its bright yellow stain visible from the air, a captured crew, and the very specific, highly unusual circumstances of its exposure. The Soviet Union, for its part, was apoplectic. To have one of its prized spy assets not only detected but incapacitated, and by such an utterly unconventional method, was a colossal embarrassment. Their initial response was predictable: outright denial. The vessel, Moscow declared, was a weather research submarine that had strayed off course due to equipment malfunction and adverse weather, then was harassed by aggressive American fishing vessels. This narrative was quickly undermined by the Whiskey class designation, a well-known military submarine type, and the undeniable presence of specialized surveillance equipment found on board by U.S. Navy salvage teams. Amidst this global diplomatic firestorm, Mary and the islanders found themselves in an uncomfortable spotlight. A small contingent of military and government officials descended upon Monhegan. They weren't looking for heroes. They were looking for answers, and perhaps someone to blame. They interrogated Mary and John, Hemlock, Tom, and Ben. They were meticulous, probing, and utterly bewildered by the story. How could they explain to their superiors that a woman, using old quarry equipment and modified lobster pots, had achieved what their multi-billion-dollar military apparatus could not? Mary, however, remained calm. She presented her meticulously kept logbook, her sketches of the sub's movements, her notes on the hums and the sabotage. She spoke with quiet authority, detailing every step of their plan, every instance of dismissal from official channels. She held up the metallic fragment she'd found, now confirmed as a piece of specialized Soviet hull plating. The officials, initially condescending, gradually shifted to an uneasy respect. They couldn't refute her evidence, her logic, or the sheer, undeniable reality floating just offshore. The island itself became a temporary military zone. Naval vessels patrolled its waters, helicopters buzzed overhead, and uniformed personnel were everywhere. The once quiet docks hummed with activity as salvage operations began on the Soviet submarine. The Whiskey-class vessel, now a hollowed-out ghost of its former self, was slowly, painstakingly towed to a secure naval base for forensic examination, its secrets laid bare to American intelligence. The disabled Soviet submarine, codenamed Whiskey 49 by U.S. intelligence, became an immediate treasure trove of Cold War secrets. Towed under heavy guard to a secure naval facility, it was meticulously dismantled, studied, and analyzed. What American intelligence operatives found inside would send shockwaves through the highest echelons of government and reshape their understanding of Soviet capabilities. Whiskey 49 wasn't just any submarine. It was a highly modified intelligence-gathering vessel. Its primary mission, as evidenced by its unique equipment, was acoustic espionage. While standard Whiskey-class subs were primarily attack submarines, this one was stripped of some torpedo tubes and instead bristled with arrays of advanced hydrophones and passive sonar equipment. Its purpose: to secretly record American naval communications, track the acoustic signatures of U.S. Navy submarines and surface vessels, and map the highly sensitive underwater listening lines that formed the backbone of American anti-submarine defenses. The most shocking discovery was its specific mission: to monitor and, if possible, tap into Project Caesar, a top-secret U.S. Navy underwater sound surveillance system. This system, a network of hydrophones laid on the ocean floor, was designed to detect Soviet submarines far from U.S. shores. Whiskey 49 was effectively trying to blind America's underwater ears, operating perilously close to key data relay points near the Maine coast. This wasn't just a casual intrusion. It was a highly targeted, aggressive act of espionage. Its presence in the deep trenches off Monhegan Island wasn't random either. Intelligence analysts, correlating Mary's detailed observations with the sub's design, realized the Soviets had chosen the area for its complex underwater topography, which provided natural acoustic shielding. It allowed the sub to sit and listen, undetected, blending into the background noise of the ocean. The hum Mary had been hearing was likely the faint, suppressed operational noise of its advanced listening equipment, or perhaps the subtle thrum of its engines as it maneuvered to maintain station in the tricky currents. The small, rigid stone Mary had found on her doorstep. Investigators later determined it was a geological sample, likely dropped by a shore party from the submarine, analyzing the local geology for potential landing sites or equipment deployment. The footprints were indeed those of Soviet sailors, conducting covert reconnaissance or equipment maintenance trips to the island under the cover of fog or darkness, explaining the mysterious sabotages, like the cut lobster lines and the damaged dinghy, which were likely attempts to deter local fishermen from venturing too close to their operational area. The green glow Mary and John had witnessed was identified as a unique chemical signature from a specific type of Soviet experimental sonar, used for short-range obstacle avoidance in low-light conditions. The shredded dock wasn't just an act of sabotage. It was likely a desperate, last-ditch effort to cover their tracks, or perhaps a warning, after they realized their presence had been compromised. They hadn't intended to sink. They had intended to disappear, leaving a trail of terror and doubt. The capture of Whiskey 49 had immense strategic implications. It provided invaluable intelligence about Soviet submarine design, acoustic capabilities, and espionage tactics. It exposed vulnerabilities in U.S. coastal defenses and forced a complete reevaluation of naval security protocols. The information gleaned from the submarine helped to improve American anti-submarine warfare techniques, potentially saving countless lives in future conflicts, both real and potential. It was a windfall of intelligence that no amount of traditional spying could have achieved. For the crew of Whiskey 49, their mission ended in humiliation and capture. Under interrogation, they revealed they had been operating in the area for weeks, painstakingly gathering data. They confirmed the psychological toll of Mary's sonic assault, describing it as an unbearable, disorienting noise that resonated through the hull, making operations impossible and threatening to damage their delicate acoustic equipment. They confessed that the decision to surface and deploy the distress buoy was made only when the damage became critical, and the alternative was to sink with all hands. Their orders were absolute: never to be detected, never to be captured. They had failed on both counts. Mary Johnson, the fisherman's wife, had not only caught a submarine, she had unmasked a critical piece of the Cold War's silent chess game. She had proven that human ingenuity, local knowledge, and an unwavering belief in one's own observations could overcome even the most sophisticated technological secrets of a superpower. Her actions had pulled back the curtain on a hidden struggle, revealing a dangerous game being played just below the surface of ordinary American life. And while the Cold War may have ended, the shadows it cast and the lessons it taught continue to resonate. If you're fascinated by the covert operations and unsung heroes of the Cold War, you won't want to miss our next video.